there's a question that sits heavy in your chest. One that you don't always say out loud, but it's there in the quiet moments, in the nights when your mind won't stop replaying everything, in the spaces where their presence used to be. Why would God let this happen to you? Why would something that felt so real, so meaningful, so deeply connected, end in confusion, distance, and pain? You didn't go into this trying to get hurt. You didn't open your heart just to be left questioning your worth. You showed up with sincerity, with patience, with a willingness to understand someone who struggled to understand themselves. And somehow, despite all of that, you were the one who ended up carrying the weight of it all. And what makes it even harder is that part of you still sees the good in them. Part of you still remembers the moments where it felt genuine, where it felt like maybe, just maybe, this could turn into something real. So the pain doesn't just come from losing them, it comes from losing what you believed you had. And that's where the question begins to cut deeper. If God is supposed to guide you, protect you, and lead you toward what's meant for you, then why would he allow you to walk straight into something that would hurt you like this? It feels contradictory, it feels unfair, and if you're being honest, it shakes something inside you. Not just your trust in people, but your trust in the process itself. But what if this wasn't punishment? What if this wasn't God choosing you to suffer or testing you in a way that was meant to break you? Because when you're in the middle of this kind of pain, it's easy to internalize it. You start asking yourself what you did wrong. You replay your words, your actions, your timing. You wonder if you were too much or maybe not enough. You question if you should have been more patient, more understanding, more detached, less emotional, less invested. And slowly, without even realizing it, you begin to carry responsibility for something that was never fully yours to carry. But this wasn't about you being defective. This wasn't about you failing some invisible test. Sometimes the reason God allows something painful isn't to punish you, it's to reveal something to you. And revelation doesn't always come in gentle ways. Sometimes it comes through disruption, through discomfort, through situations that force you to see what you were unwilling or unable to see before. Because if everything had stayed easy, consistent, and comfortable, you would have stayed. You would have kept investing, kept hoping, kept believing in something that wasn't actually capable of meeting you where you needed to be met. And that's the part that's hard to accept. Not because it's unclear, but because deep down, you already felt it at times. You noticed the inconsistency. You felt the emotional distance. You sensed the hesitation, the pulling back, the subtle ways they kept one foot out the door, but you gave it meaning that allowed you to stay. You told yourself they just needed time, that they were scared, that if you showed them enough stability, enough understanding, enough love, they would eventually meet you in that space. And that belief kept you there longer than your peace could afford. And this is where another truth begins to surface, one that changes the way you see everything that happened. You didn't just love who they were, you loved who they could be. You saw their potential. You saw glimpses of depth, moments of vulnerability, flashes of connection that made you feel like there was something real underneath it all. And those moments felt powerful enough to hold on to, powerful enough to justify the confusion, the inconsistency, the emotional unavailability that came with it. But potential is not the same as capacity. And this is where so many people get caught without even realizing it. You can see the best in someone, you can believe in who they could become, you can even feel deeply connected to their inner world, but if they don't have the emotional capacity to show up consistently, to communicate clearly, to hold space for the kind of connection you're trying to build, then what you're holding onto isn't something real, it's something imagined. And that doesn't make you naive, it makes you human. It means you love deeply. It means you don't just look at people on the surface, you look at who they could be if they healed, if they opened up, if they chose to grow. But the truth is, you can't build a relationship on someone's potential, because potential doesn't show up when you need reassurance. Potential doesn't communicate when things get difficult. Potential doesn't stay consistent when emotions get real. Capacity does. And if someone doesn't have that capacity, no amount of your understanding, your patience, or your love can create it for them. So when things started to fall apart, when the distance became more obvious, when the effort became one-sided, when the confusion started outweighing the clarity, it didn't happen randomly. It wasn't just bad timing. It was exposure. It was everything that was hidden beneath the surface, finally becoming impossible to ignore. And this is where God's role in all of this becomes clearer, even if it doesn't feel comforting right away. Because sometimes what God removes or disrupts isn't something that was right for you, it's something you were trying to make right. And there's a difference. You were trying to create stability in something that was inconsistent. You were trying to build emotional safety with someone who wasn't emotionally available. You were trying to turn moments into meaning, and meaning into something permanent. But God sees beyond moments. He sees patterns. He sees what something will turn into, not just what it feels like in the beginning. And if something is built on uncertainty, on emotional distance, on inconsistency that keeps you questioning yourself, then no matter how good it feels in certain moments, it's not aligned with the kind of love that's meant for you. So instead of letting you stay in something that would slowly drain you, confuse you, and disconnect you from yourself, it gets disrupted, not because you didn't deserve it, but because you deserved something more stable, more secure, more real. And sometimes the only way to remove something you're emotionally attached to is to let it break in a way you can no longer ignore. And that's where one of the hardest realizations begins to settle in. The pain you're feeling right now isn't just about them leaving or pulling away. It's about the meaning you gave the connection. It's about the belief that this was something that could grow into what you needed. It's about the emotional investment you made based on what you thought it could become. And when that collapses, it doesn't just hurt. It disorients you, because now you're left trying to understand what was real, what wasn't, and how something that felt so strong could end up feeling so empty. But this is also where the shift begins, because as painful as it is, this experience is showing you something that clarity alone never could. It's showing you the difference between feeling something deeply and being met deeply. It's showing you that connection without consistency creates confusion, not security. It's showing you that love, real love, isn't something you have to constantly question, analyze, or hold together on your own. And most importantly, it's showing you that just because you can understand someone, just because you can empathize with their fears, their patterns, their emotional walls, doesn't mean you're meant to stay and navigate them at the cost of yourself. Because the truth that changes everything isn't just about why this happened, it's about what it's trying to teach you. And even though it doesn't feel like it right now, this wasn't meant to break your ability to love. It was meant to break your attachment to a version of love that was never going to fully hold you. And once you begin to see that, something inside you starts to shift, even if it's subtle at first, because the pain no longer feels completely meaningless. It still hurts, it still lingers, but it starts to carry a different kind of weight. Not just loss, but awareness. And this is where you begin to realize that the connection didn't just bring emotions to the surface, it brought you to the surface. The parts of you that were quietly waiting to be seen, the patterns you didn't know you were repeating, the ways you were showing up in love that were shaped more by your wounds than your wholeness. Because the truth is, the avoidant didn't just hurt you, they mirrored something back to you. They reflected the part of you that was willing to overextend, to overgive, to stay patient beyond your limits in the hope that love would eventually stabilize. They reflected the part of you that felt responsible for maintaining the connection, even when it started to feel one-sided. And that's not something to judge yourself for. It's something to understand. Because when you've learned, consciously or unconsciously, that love requires effort, proving, waiting, or earning, you don't always recognize when you're giving more than you're receiving. You don't always notice when you're abandoning your own needs just to keep something from falling apart. And this connection, as painful as it became, revealed that pattern in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. Because if you look back honestly, there were moments where you felt the imbalance, moments where you felt like you were the one holding everything together. You were the one trying to communicate, to understand, to create clarity where there was confusion. And even though part of you felt that something wasn't right, another part of you kept pushing forward, kept believing that if you just stayed a little longer, loved a little deeper, gave a little more, things would shift. But that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from a place within you that equated persistence with love, that believed that staying even when it was hard was what made something real. And that's where the lesson begins to deepen, because love isn't meant to feel like something you have to constantly hold together on your own. It's not meant to feel like a responsibility you carry while the other person remains uncertain, distant, or emotionally unavailable. Real love meets you, it moves toward you, it creates clarity, not confusion, and when that's missing, no amount of your effort can replace it. And this is where another layer of truth begins to unfold, one that can be difficult to accept, but is necessary for your growth. You were loving from a place that still needed healing, not because your love wasn't real, but because it was shaped by parts of you that were still trying to feel chosen, still trying to feel secure, still trying to find validation in someone else's ability to stay. And again, that's not something to feel ashamed of, it's something to recognize. Because when you're loving from a wounded place, you're more likely to tolerate things that don't actually align with your needs. You're more likely to justify inconsistency, to rationalize emotional distance, to interpret mixed signals as something that just needs more time. And that's exactly how you end up staying in situations that slowly drain you. Not because you don't see the issues, but because you've learned to prioritize the connection over your own sense of stability. And this is where God's role in all of this becomes even more intentional. Because if you had stayed in that pattern, if nothing had disrupted it, it wouldn't have healed you. It would have reinforced the very wounds you were meant to outgrow. So instead of allowing that cycle to continue, something had to shift. And that shift didn't come in the form of a gentle realization or a quiet understanding. It came through emotional impact, through loss, through distance, through a breaking point that forced you to stop and see everything for what it really was. And as painful as that is, it's also purposeful, because sometimes the only way to truly break a pattern is to experience it fully, to the point where you can no longer ignore how it makes you feel, to the point where staying in it becomes more painful than walking away from it. And that's exactly where you were being led, not into pain for no reason, but into awareness that would change the way you show up in love moving forward. Because once you see the pattern clearly, once you feel the emotional cost of it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending that inconsistency feels like love. You can't keep calling confusion a connection. And that awareness, even though it comes through pain, is what protects you from repeating the same experience again. And this is where another truth begins to take shape, one that reframes everything you thought you lost. Because what if they weren't removed from your life randomly? What if their distance, their inconsistency, their inability to fully meet you was actually the very reason they couldn't stay? Not because they didn't care at all, not because nothing was ever real, but because they didn't have the capacity to be what you needed. And capacity isn't something you can create for someone. It's not something you can inspire into existence through patience or understanding. It's something they have to develop within themselves. And if they haven't done that work, if they're still operating from avoidance, from emotional unavailability, from fear of closeness, then no matter how strong the connection feels, it won't sustain, because a relationship can only go as deep as both people are able and willing to go. And if one person is holding back, pulling away, or unable to fully engage, the connection will always feel incomplete. And that's not something you caused. That's something you encountered. So when things started to fall apart, when the distance became undeniable, when the effort stopped being mutual, it wasn't just an ending, it was a form of protection. It was God stepping in, not to take something good away from you, but to prevent you from building your future on something that couldn't support you. Because imagine if it hadn't ended. Imagine if you had continued investing, continuing hoping, continuing trying to make it work with someone who couldn't fully meet you. Over time, that wouldn't have just hurt you. It would have changed you. It would have made you question your worth more deeply. It would have made you shrink your needs, silence your feelings, and accept less than what you truly deserve, just to keep the connection alive. And that's not the kind of love you're meant for. That's not the kind of relationship that aligns with your growth, your peace, or your emotional well-being. So even though it feels like something was taken from you, what actually happened is that something misaligned was removed before it could take more from you than you realized. And this is where the perspective begins to shift in a way that changes how you carry this experience. Because instead of seeing yourself as someone who was rejected, you start to see yourself as someone who was redirected. Redirected away from a dynamic that was rooted in imbalance, redirected away from a pattern that would have kept you stuck in emotional uncertainty, redirected toward a version of yourself that no longer settles for potential over consistency, that no longer confuses intensity with stability, that no longer feels responsible for creating a connection that requires two people to build. And that redirection doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like loss. Sometimes it feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like you're being forced to let go of something you weren't ready to release. But over time, as clarity replaces emotion, you begin to understand why it had to happen this way. Because if it had ended quietly, if it had faded without impact, you might have gone back. You might have reopened the door. You might have stayed connected to something that wasn't truly aligned with you. But this kind of ending, the kind that leaves a mark, the kind that forces reflection, it creates closure in a way that protects your future, even if it hurts your present. And within that pain, there's also a deeper invitation, an invitation to reconnect with yourself in a way you may not have before. Because somewhere along the way, in trying to hold on to that connection, you may have drifted from your own center. You may have started prioritizing their needs, their pace, their emotional availability over your own. You may have silenced parts of yourself just to keep things from becoming too heavy, too real, too demanding for them. And now, in their absence, those parts of you are coming back into focus. The parts that need clarity, the parts that need consistency, the parts that deserve to feel safe, chosen, and valued without having to earn it. And this is where healing begins. Not in forgetting them, not in pretending it didn't matter, but in understanding what it revealed about you. Because the goal isn't to close your heart, it's to open it more consciously, to love in a way that includes yourself, that honors your needs, that recognizes when something feels off instead of explaining it away. And that kind of love, the kind that is grounded in self-awareness and emotional clarity, doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from learning through it. So as you sit with everything that happened, as you process the memories, the emotions, the questions that still come and go, understand this. You weren't led into this experience to be broken. You were led into it to be shown something that would change the way you love, the way you choose, and the way you see yourself moving forward. And even though it came through someone who couldn't meet you, couldn't stay, couldn't give you what you truly needed, it gave you something else instead. It gave you awareness, it gave you clarity, it gave you a deeper understanding of what love is not, so you can finally recognize what it is when it comes into your life in a real, stable, and aligned way. And when that awareness starts to settle in, something else begins to surface. Something that's uncomfortable, but deeply transformative. You start to see not just what they did, but what you allowed, not in a way that blames you, but in a way that empowers you. Because for a long time, it was easier to focus on their inconsistency, their distance, their inability to show up, than it was to look at the moments where you chose to stay, despite feeling the imbalance. And that's a hard truth to sit with, because it forces you to acknowledge that you weren't just a passive participant in this experience, you were actively holding on to something that was slowly showing you it couldn't hold you. You were interpreting silence as depth, inconsistency as complexity, distance as something that just needed patience. And again, that doesn't make you weak. It means you were trying to love in the only way you knew how. But now you're being shown a different way, a way where love doesn't require you to abandon yourself just to keep someone else. Because one of the deepest lessons hidden inside this kind of connection is this: you don't just attract what you desire, you also allow what you haven't yet decided to walk away from. And that realization changes everything, because it shifts you out of a place of powerlessness and into a place of responsibility. Not responsibility for their behavior, but responsibility for your boundaries, your standards, your willingness to stay or leave when something no longer aligns with your emotional well-being. And this is where God's role becomes even more intentional, because sometimes He doesn't just show you who someone is, He shows you what you're still willing to tolerate. He brings you face to face with the very patterns that have been quietly shaping your relationships, not to shame you, but to free you from them, because you can't change what you're not aware of. And now you're aware in a way that you weren't before. You're aware of how it feels to be in something where you're not fully met. You're aware of the emotional exhaustion that comes from trying to maintain a connection that lacks consistency. You're aware of the quiet anxiety that builds when you don't know where you stand, when communication isn't clear, when effort isn't mutual. And that awareness, it becomes your guide. Because once you've felt that contrast, once you've experienced what it's like to give your heart to something that can't fully receive it, you begin to crave something different, not just emotionally, but deeply internally. You begin to understand that love isn't just about connection, it's about alignment. It's about being with someone who not only feels something for you, but is capable of expressing it, maintaining it, and building something stable with it. And anything less than that, no matter how intense or meaningful it feels in certain moments, will eventually leave you feeling empty. And this is where another realization begins to take hold. One that reframes the pain in a way that shifts how you see the entire experience. You were settling, even if you didn't realize it at the time. You were accepting a version of love that required you to constantly adjust, constantly understand, constantly be the one holding emotional space, without receiving the same in return. You were normalizing inconsistency because the moments of connection felt so strong. You were calling it complicated, calling it timing, calling it something worth fighting for. But deep down, there was a part of you that felt the truth. A part of you that knew this wasn't stable, that this wasn't secure, that this wasn't the kind of love that allows you to relax into it without fear of losing it, but you stayed connected to the hope of what it could become instead of grounding yourself in what it consistently was. And that's where the pain deepens, because it's not just about losing them. It's about realizing you were holding on to something that was never fully holding you. And that realization doesn't come to hurt you, it comes to elevate you. Because once you see that you were settling, you also begin to understand that you don't have to settle anymore. You begin to recognize that love is not meant to feel like emotional uncertainty. It's not meant to feel like something you have to constantly question or analyze. Real love brings clarity. It brings consistency. It creates a sense of emotional safety where you don't feel like you're walking on unstable ground. And this is where your perspective begins to shift in a way that changes how you approach love moving forward. Because instead of chasing connection, you start valuing consistency. Instead of being drawn to intensity, you start recognizing stability as something deeper, something more meaningful. And that shift, it's not something you could have fully understood without going through what you just experienced. Because this experience didn't just show you what love isn't, it showed you what happens when you try to heal inside the same pattern that hurt you. You were trying to create security with someone who operated from avoidance. You were trying to build emotional closeness with someone who pulled away when things got real. And as much as you wanted to believe that your presence, your understanding, your patience could change that, it couldn't. Not because you weren't enough, but because healing doesn't happen through someone else's effort. It happens through personal awareness and internal work. And if someone isn't ready to face themselves, to confront their patterns, to open up in a consistent and intentional way, then no relationship, no matter how meaningful, will be able to override that. And that's why staying wouldn't have healed you. It would have kept you in a cycle where you were constantly trying to earn something that should have been given freely. And this is where the truth becomes even clearer. You can't heal in the same environment that broke you. You can't find emotional safety in a space that consistently triggers your insecurity. You can't build something stable with someone who isn't stable within themselves. And as hard as it is to accept, that's exactly why this connection had to end or shift in the way that it did. Not to take something away from you, but to remove you from a cycle that was slowly disconnecting you from your own sense of self. Because over time, when you stay in something like that, you start to lose your clarity. You start to question your intuition. You start to adapt to inconsistency in ways that feel normal, even though they're not healthy. And the longer you stay, the harder it becomes to recognize what you truly need, because you've become so focused on maintaining what you have. So instead of allowing that to continue, something interrupted it. Something forced a shift that you may not have chosen on your own. And that's where the deeper meaning of this experience begins to take shape. Because sometimes God doesn't just answer your prayers by giving you what you want. Sometimes He answers them by removing what's standing in the way of what you actually need. And that removal doesn't always feel like an answer. At first, sometimes it feels like loss, like confusion, like everything you were hoping for just slipped out of your hands without warning. But over time, as you begin to reconnect with yourself, as you begin to rebuild your sense of clarity and emotional stability, you start to see that what was removed wasn't aligned with where you're being led. It wasn't aligned with the kind of love that supports your growth, your peace, and your sense of self-worth. And within that realization, there's also a quiet kind of strength that begins to form, because now you're not just someone who loves deeply, you're someone who understands deeply. You understand the difference between connection and compatibility. You understand the difference between potential and presence. You understand that just because something feels intense doesn't mean it's meant to last. And that understanding becomes your protection. It becomes the thing that helps you choose differently, that helps you recognize early on when something isn't aligned, that helps you walk away before you lose yourself in the process. And that doesn't mean you stop loving. It doesn't mean you become closed off or guarded in a way that prevents connection. It means you become intentional. You become aware. You become someone who no longer confuses emotional availability with emotional depth. And that's the transformation that this experience is leading you toward. Not just healing, but elevation. Not just letting go, but growing into a version of yourself that no longer accepts what once felt familiar but unhealthy. Because the truth is, you didn't go through this just to move on from one person. You went through this to move on from a pattern. A way of loving that required you to give more than you received. A way of connecting that left you feeling uncertain instead of secure. And now you're stepping into something different, something more aligned, something that reflects not just your ability to love, but your understanding of what love should actually feel like.